In the name of our living and loving God who creates us, redeems us, and sustains us. Amen. Please sit down. So let's go back to Sunday school for a bit. And while I don't invite you to shout the answers out, this is after all a cathedral, nevertheless, you should be murmuring them among yourselves. 3 reasons why are Moses and Elijah revealed alongside Jesus. Why are they there? What do they represent? What are they about? Well, firstly, they're a bit like your photos of your granddads on the mantelpiece. They're there to talk about the past. They're there to talk about the fact that Jesus is in a line of continuity. Moses and Elijah are the forebears, the forerunners. Secondly, they're there because it's the mountaintop. And Moses and Elijah have had their own mountaintop experiences. And now here Jesus is on the mountaintop with disciples. And they make that link to the mountaintop space. But there's a third reason, harder to discover unless you remember your Sunday school stories, but a far more challenging and I'd say ultimately healing story. So ask yourself, and maybe whisper to your neighbor, what happens when Moses comes down from his mountaintop, Mount Sinai, gathering with him those 2 tablets of stone that we heard Tim read about in the first reading? What does Moses discover when he gets to the bottom of the mountain? Remember? He discovers that Israel has abandoned the God who had led them out of Egypt. They think that Moses is never coming back, so they make a golden calf to worship. And in the wonderful authorized version, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play, by which we mean all sorts of goings on. And Moses gets to the bottom of the mountain, sees all this going on, throws down the tablets of stone, despairs. And what happens to Elijah on his mountain? Bit harder to remember that story. Well, Elijah has come fresh from triumphing over the prophets of Baal. He has challenged them to a contest. Can they make fire fall from heaven? And Elijah does not behave in a particularly admirable way in this encounter. First of all, he invites them, these prophets of Baal, to call upon their great god Baal, which they do, dancing around and gashing themselves with knives till the blood flows free. And Elijah takes the mickey out of them. Maybe your God's asleep. Maybe he's gone for a walk. Maybe he's gone a bit deaf in his old age. Call louder. And then really showing off and getting into his stride, Elijah causes the sacrifice on which fire is to fall, his sacrifice, to be doused with water, so much water that the ditches are filled with water. And then Elijah prays and fire falls, which would be all well and good if that was where it ended. What does Elijah do after that? Remember Mendelssohn's great oratorio. Take all the prophets of Baal, let not one of them escape you. Take them and slay them. So all the prophets of Baal are put to the sword. More blood is spilt. And good old Queen Jezebel, Elijah's ancient enemy, sends a message saying, the Lord do the same to me as you did to those prophets if I don't kill you like you killed my prophets. At which point, all of the great big school playground bully that Elijah has been evaporates, and he runs away into the desert and lies down under a bush and asks to die, because Israel has not returned to the God of Jacob, of Isaac, of Esau, of Abraham, and Jezebel's after him, and all of his great, wonderful self-projection has come to nothing. His ministry is in ruins, tatters. So, Lord, take away my life, he prays. But God's not done with him yet. A raven is sent to feed him. He must make a journey to Horeb. And that's where he must encounter the God who he has tried to serve, but has let rather too much of himself get in the way. And remember that encounter with God. The great earthquake splitting the rocks. God's not in the earthquake. The great wind. God's not in the wind. The great fire. God's not in the fire. And there follows a sound like sheer silence. A mountaintop silence. And then he knows God is there. And God's message for him is really simple. It's time to hand it over. It's time to let go of your ministry. It's time to anoint somebody else to be a king, somebody else to be a prophet. You've done what you could do. It's now time to hand it over, let go, and get ready to die. That's the third reason Moses and Elijah are there. That's what they're giving Jesus. He knows it already, but they are there as a kind of testimony of history about handing it over. Because Jesus knows that the minute he comes down from the mountainside, he's going to have to start letting go of all that he has done and been. As he sets his face towards Jerusalem, it's going to be a gradual, progressive process of letting go, allowing himself to be handed over, to be the sacrifice that makes our peace with God, the sacrifice that ends all sacrifice. So that's what Moses and Elijah are. They're the ones who are witnessing to the laying down. His life, Jesus' life, has always been a life of transparency to God's will. And this is the logical consequence of that journey of transparency. The laying down, so that through him, the magnifying, burning rays of God's love might set fire to the world in resurrection, hope, and new life. But this mountaintop must end. So what about us? Well, perhaps Moses, Elijah, Jesus are messages for you and I as we begin our Lenten journey. How will we live that transparency? How will we live that generous, outpouring, self-giving love? How will we live in the way that Moses and Elijah had to learn to live, a bit less of them, so as to make a bit more room for God to work and live through them? How are you and I going to do that in Lent? Because that's the question we're asked every year as we relive Lent. How are we going to make a bit more space for God to be at work and at life through us? One really little example, and then one much bigger example. I've had a few conversations with people over the past week about how we are here on a Sunday morning before the service begins. Some people live on their own, and they live with silence all through the week. It's not mountaintop. It can sometimes feel a bit desolate. No conversation, no voices other than those on the radio or television. So some people, when they come to church here on a Sunday morning, they like a nice chat. Because it's good to see your friends. It's good to catch up. And maybe someone's had a bad week and they're a bit sad and distressed and they need a bit of comfort. So for some people, it's really important to have a bit of a chat before the service because it's about making those links, making community again. Other people have had all too many voices during their week and they long for a bit of silence before the service starts, a bit of space to say their prayers. And if someone's sitting around them having a chat, it's distracting. So what do we do as a Christian community? Well, the bad news is it's not my job to tell you, because you're all adults. You don't need me to tell you. But how would it be to make our own decisions about how we respond to this gentle little conundrum in the light of that self-giving, outpouring love that Jesus mirrors as he comes down from the mountainside and sets out towards Jerusalem? We make our own decision about what we do before church on a Sunday morning, but we do it in the context of the self-outpouring, generous and abundant love that Jesus lives and dies. And then a much bigger example. I'm well challenged by our living Lent. I'm well challenged to take that leaflet home and do some work on myself about what star rating I give myself for my recycling and heating levels and water usage. But we feel helpless, don't we? We feel there's nothing we can do in the face of the climate emergency, that for some of us it feels like it's almost already too late. And what can Jesus experience and change just with one life allowing itself to be poured out? The fact that we're all here 2,000 years later suggests world-shattering change. Human beings are not helpless. We are not helpless. as individuals, if we live in the light of that self-outpouring love, then we discover again that we are linked with those who live in low-lying islands in the Pacific Ocean who are at risk of flood and starvation. We are linked with the children who scrabble on the rubbish heaps in the great cities of India. We are linked with them. We are fellow human beings with them. And we can bring about change, even at this 11th hour, in the little ways in which we live, more lightly treading upon our earth, more unselfishly in how we use its resources, more passionately, politically, and in a more committed way about how we are determined to be good stewards of God's creation. And finally, for those who brought Caden to baptism today, how you bring him up, you, his parents and godparents and grandparents, if you do so, this difficult journey of parenting, this joyful journey, with the one simple image of that abundant self-giving love that Jesus shows as he makes his journey to Jerusalem, then you won't go far wrong. If you teach Caden to be transparent, to let the light shine through him, then you'll be transparent, and he will be transparent, and he will bring about change for good in this darkened world. The challenge of the Lenten journey that faces us is to walk with Jesus to Jerusalem, and in all the decisions we make, to allow his abundant transparency to shine through us and become us, become who we are, so that the next 40 days and 40 nights aren't just a routine to be gone through again. They're a chance of renewal for ourselves, for our community, and for our world.